Well, good afternoon. I am Reverend Sherry L. Brown Jackson from Alexandria, Louisiana. We're continuing our study of the Old Testament, the first five books of the Bible. Tonight we are beginning with Leviticus, a book of worship. Um, we just decided to end Exodus because the rest of the last couple of chapters deal with the actual building of the tabernacle. Remember all of those instructions that were God had given about how to build his tabernacle. The people were actually building it. And so I just decided to skip that because we had kind of like went over it a little bit, and so we will pick up some of that in Leviticus, because what was built and put in place in Exodus, at the end of Exodus, will actually be used in the book of Leviticus. And I know when you got your lesson, you said, oh my gosh, Leviticus, that is one of the hardest books to read. And it is. It is not one that we keep up with typically, but I want to suggest that it is one that we need to pay close attention to, because many of the things that we do in our worship experiences, our worship services, so to speak, has some roots in Leviticus, and specifically the New Testament. Again, I suggest you can never begin to understand the New Testament unless you understand the Old Testament, and specifically the first five books of the Bible. And especially, you will never understand Hebrews without understanding Leviticus. So the book of Leviticus is the third book of the Pentateuch, the third book of our Old Testament, the third book of the Jewish Bible, the third book of the Torah. And this book is specifically addressed to the sons of Israel and Aaron and his descendants. In other words, this book is specifically addressed to the Levites, those who would handle the worship, those who would be in charge of the tabernacle. Now, even though it is written specifically for the Levites, there is a part for the people. There is the work of the priest and also the work of the people. Some would say it is the work of the clergy and the work of laity. The priest will be the clergy, the people will be the laity. So there is the work for the preacher, so to speak, and there's also the work for the people. So as a whole, it is for the entire community of Israel, but there are some things that we could learn from it. As we look at the book of Leviticus, we need to pay attention to three major concepts, and we need to keep this book in context. Its historical context, its social cultural context, and also its theological context. This book is unique in that it is largely God's record of instructions to Moses. So a lot of the book of Leviticus is God talking, God giving Moses some specific instructions. 20 of the 27 chapters begin with the Lord spoke to Moses, or some variations of that. So again, this book is a lot of instructions given to the people, given to Moses, about how to approach him, how to approach a holy God. How should an unholy people approach a holy God? So this picture should be familiar to you. Remember, we said that God had instructed them to build him a house. Now, if we look at this picture, we see the big square, I would just say, is all of this is called the tent of the meeting. The tent of the meeting. Inside the tent of the meeting is the tabernacle. Is the tabernacle. Remember, only the priests were able to get, the high priests were able to get to the tabernacle. If we look at Leviticus 1:1, it will tell you exactly what is going on. It says, then the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of the meeting. Now, what's important to understand is that when the last time Moses is inside the tent of the meeting, in other words, Moses is inside but the tent of the meeting, but he is not inside the tabernacle. So God is speaking to Moses from the tabernacle. God is in the tabernacle, but Moses is in the tent. Okay? Only Moses was inside the tent for the presence of Yahweh. And Yahweh's presence is shown by the pillar of cloud that would descend and stand at the entrance. The book of Leviticus begins with Yahweh on the inside of the tabernacle calling to Moses on the outside. So again, Moses is on the outside of the tabernacle and God is speaking to him from the inside. God is giving Moses the laws for worship, and personal and national holiness is establishes a culture of how the people are to serve God and how they are to be separated unto God. It established the rules that says there is a separation. Israel is being separated unto God and God alone. So again, God is giving the instructions on how to be the people that he has called them to be. Remember, in Exodus 19:6, God says, you shall be. Remember when he established the covenant, you shall be my people and I'm going to be your God. I'm going to make you into a holy people and a kingdom of priests. So Leviticus is a continuation of Exodus. Now remember, again, when the Bible was originally written, it would not have been done in books, chapters, and verses. So it would have just kind of like been scroll after scroll after scroll. And so Leviticus is just a continuation of Exodus. But in order to make sense of these of the writings, it was put into books and chapters and verses so it could make sense to us to kind of have it in some type of logical form. So again, Leviticus is a continuation of Exodus. It completes the details of the tabernacle. It informs Israel the functions of the tabernacle in the covenant relationship with Yahweh. So Exodus ends with the construction of the tabernacle, and Leviticus tells of the worship that is to take place on the inside of the tabernacle. So again, Exodus is the construction of the tabernacle. Now that the tabernacle is up, Leviticus tells how the people are to worship, or how worship is to take place in the tabernacle. So again, at the beginning of the book, Moses is in the tent, but outside of the tabernacle. Pastor Green, did you want to add something? Okay, maybe he's not hearing me yet.
Oh, the lightning.
Pastor
Can you
Green.
hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the last time we saw Moses in Exodus, it was dark clouds, lightning flashing on the mountain, real dramatic experience. Moses went up to the mountain for his 40-day encounter with God. And so the people saw Moses going up out of sight into the cloud, into the mountain with the lightning and the fire and God speaking. Now, as you share with us, the tent of the tabernacle is constructed based on the instructions God gave Moses. And so if we focus on the book of Leviticus, from chapter 1 through 10 gives us the way to God, and chapter 11 through 27 talks about the walk with God. And so if we listen to you and to the word as we go forward, we will see an unholy people has a way to God through sacrifice, offering, worship. That the instructions from God is given to Moses. Moses passed it on to Aaron and his sons, and they pass it on to the people. I think what I'm trying to say, I hope we draw from the book of Leviticus, that the person that God speaks to is never to keep the word that God speaks to that person, because it's not just for that person, it's for the people. So the instruction that God gave Moses was to pass on to Aaron and his son, that Aaron and his son may pass it on to the people, that an unholy people would have a way to a holy God through a sacrificial system. If we can draw from that and connect that to our worship and our experience today, it would be so much easier for all of us. And so it's my prayer that we see the transition from the mountain, the cloud, the fire, to the tent of meetings, the tabernacle, the altar, and that you shared with us. And I think in the photo you shared with us, we saw as if there was a light coming straight down from heaven over the Holy of Holiness behind the veil. There are some places for the public. There are some places for the priests. And my prayer is that we don't lose that as we study.
I think that very last statement that you said, that there are some places for the public and there are some places for the priests, and that we should not that the priests were any better than the people, but God had set them apart for a specific task. Just as God calls people today, which we will call preachers, pastors, those in the clergy, are called for specific tasks. And so they must know how to do the work of the preacher. They must know how to do the work of the priest. They must know how to do that work. The people cannot do that. The priest, the preacher, there is, again, we talked about, I think last week, or when we were talking about the building of the tabernacle, there is, in some churches, there is a banister. Specifically, I know in the Methodist church, the Catholic church, there is a banister that separates the people from the pulpit. And that is just a symbol to say that the work that is done up here is different from the work that is done in the pew. One is not better than the other, but we each have a specific function. And so we should be cognizant of what happens in the pulpit because it has been set aside for a specific purpose. So thank you, Pastor Green, for bringing up that reminder. So when we look at, we have come through Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus. Genesis began with the instruction, with the creation. Exodus begins in bondage, and Leviticus begins in sacrifice. Now that word sacrifice is going to be a big concept in this book. Sacrifice, atonement, offerings, all of these are going to be words that's going to play out over and over and over. In Genesis, we see the rise of God's people. In Exodus, it tells of the redemption of God's people from Egypt. And then Leviticus shows the rituals of worship and holiness. So I hope that you can see how this is progressing and how it is connecting to each other, that you cannot separate one from the other. Genesis gives us the origins of the nation. Leviticus gives us deliverance of the nation, and Exodus gives us deliverance of the nation, and Leviticus tells us of the life of the nation. Genesis tells us of the theocracy was born, and remember theocracy, theo meaning God, God ruled, and from Exodus to Leviticus, God's rule is established. This is not a democracy, but is a theocracy. A theocracy, God rule. Okay, so when does all of this take place? This is, again, as we say, this is about 1400 BC. Now, you will see Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, all five of those books is set between 1446 and 1406. Now, some say that Moses got, while Moses was on the mountain, that God revealed what had happened to what had taken place in Genesis, okay, because obviously Moses was not there in Genesis, but God had revealed to him, had showed him, had talked to him, had told him how all of this came about, and then God gave him the laws, the instructions. So again, all of this would take place between 1446 BC to 1406. Leviticus, as we said, is the third book. It is concerning the Levites, concerning the priests. The theme of this book is worship and holiness. What does it mean to live as God's holy people? This is what this book is about. So I hope that it's beginning to make sense to you, and that you will see that this is not such a hard book to get through. Leviticus takes place within 2 years that Israel spent camped at the foot of Mount Sinai. It continues the story of Israel receiving God's instructions at Sinai. So again, it's not just the 10 Commandments. That's the one, that we pulled out. But God gave all of these instructions to Moses while they were at Sinai. The topics that we need to be concerned about, or we will be concerned about, are sacrifices and God's grace, the role of priest, purity, the Day of Atonement, and holy living. The language of worship is all throughout this book, and you'll see the word sacrifice 42 times, priest 189 times, blood 86 times, holy 87 times, and atonement 45 times. Again, these are the key words, and these words should not be new to you. Even if you hadn't read the Old Testament, these words are all through the New Testament, specifically when we talk about Christ, and especially when we get to the book of Hebrews. The very heart of the covenant, of the relationship or fellowship between Yahweh and his people, and the means of achieving it are spelled out in the opening statements with respect of the burnt offering. So if you look at Leviticus 1 and 3, well, let's just go back to 1. We'll read 1 through 3. It says, then the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of the meeting, saying, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, okay, this is God giving them instructions. When any man of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of animals from the herd or the flock. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall offer it a male without defect. He shall offer it at the doorway of the tent of the meeting, that it may be acceptable before the Lord. So right off the bat, God is saying that in order to get my attention, so to speak, offer an animal without defect, a male animal without defect. And this is going to be a big deal. Offer an animal without defect. We know we say that God is coming back for a church without spot or blemish. Well, that's the kind of offering that he wants. He's going to be looking for from them to bring a male animal without spot or without any kind of defect to it. Because remember, you cannot approach a holy God with anything. And so the purest or the best that it could be was getting as close to God as would get you as close to God as was possible at that time. So the importance of Leviticus. Now, as I said before, that many people admit to skipping over the book of Leviticus because they claim it's too dry or boring, or it has no relevance to today. But again, I want to suggest that we have to get through Leviticus in order to understand worship, in order to understand holiness, in order to understand how to approach God. If we're going to even understand the New Testament, Leviticus is quoted about 40 different times. And as I said before, that a proper understanding of the book of Hebrews is impossible without understanding Leviticus. The central theme of the book is holiness. It shows how Israel was to fulfill its covenant responsibilities to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So God says, you know, I'm going to make you, or you're going to be a holy nation, a kingdom of priests, but now I got to show you how to how to do that. Pastor Green.
Yes, please. If we could maybe make sense this way, since we in this culture, most of us, very few of us are farmers with animal or livestock. And so it may not make sense when you say a herd or a flock. Herd is one of your, from cattle. Flock would be of your sheep. Now think with me for a moment. If you only had 10 cattle, 10 cows, and one young calf with no spots, no sickness, no disease, no eye problem, and you have to go out to your livestock and get the best you have and bring to give to the preacher to be shared with the community of the church. Can't sell it, it's a gift, or go back to your flock. The best that you have and give. Cows, the price of a cow is about $1,000 a piece. And so you have 10, and you're going to give up the best one you have. And so you're giving about a tenth of what you own, because that was their way of living. And you're giving it away totally to follow the will of God, whether it's a calf or a lamb. You can't bring the sick, the lame, the blind, or the disease. A perfectly healthy, vibrant, 1-year-old animal to be given away. Most of us have difficulty paying the tithes and give offering. We make money every week. It takes about a year to grow that calf. Almost a year old. And you've fed it all year, you've worked with it all year, you've become attached to it all year, and then you're going to give it to God. Sometimes we who have not had a farm experience don't quite get the value when they said bring an animal or a year old without spot, without blemish, no defects, and give the very best you have as a sacrifice to God. To wait to God was sacrificial and challenging. And so, if we could put that in, if we could just see that in our mind, that don't just show up at church with no prayed up attitude, no attitude of worship, no word, just show up. It had to be some sacrifice, some commitment to come to this holy God. And that's a powerful way to think about. If you can vision or envision or go to Google and see what it costs for a person to raise an animal, feed, water, grain, shelter for a year, and then give it away. Maybe that might help us and see that we speak these words, but one from the flock or the herd. That's either from your cattle or your sheep. Bring the best you have to God and look for nothing in return. We're not nearly as committed as the people were in the days of the text, because we want a cheap grace and not an expensive sacrifice. Thank you.
Thank you so much. One thing that that Pastor Green talked about was giving the best that they had. And so that meant that they couldn't save the best for themselves or for their families and give I'm going to give this one because the leg is broke, or I'm going to give this one because it's got some type of infection or whatever it is. But out of obedience, they gave the best. And so let us just think about it. And it was about sacrificing. And of course, God is not asking us to sacrifice any animals, But when we come to worship, when we approach God for worship, we should come with our best. Now, how do we become defected, so to speak, or have defects or spots or blemishes? When our minds are not right, when we are not focused, when you know we our bodies are there, but our minds are on the other side of town, so to speak, or we're just not fully present, and so therefore we are not giving God the best that we have, or even the offering, so to speak, or of our giving, whether it's the tithe, the talent, or the treasure. And notice this is a collective thing, because I too fall prey to some of these things. So who are the Levites? Leviticus relates to the Levites, and remember, the Levites were the priests who were chosen of God to minister to the nation. So the priest comes from Aaron's line. The book of Leviticus contains many of the laws given by God to direct them in their work as priests for the worship of God. So again, the book is for the entire Israelite community with two purposes. One, that the people would know and value their privileges and responsibility before God. And two, that the priest could not gain oppressive power over the people with any monopoly on the knowledge of how to approach God. So it wasn't that God was giving the priest a secret set of information that the people didn't know. So the people understood the priest's responsibilities, the priest understood the people's responsibility. Nobody had a monopoly on the information. Everybody understood the functions of each party. There were no secrets. And so it is although it is heavily filled with information for the priest, it is for the entire body of people. Okay, are there any questions that anyone may have? Remember, you can send them by. You can ask them or send them by chat.
I have a question. As I was looking at the workbook, one of the questions was the list, the 3 types of burnt offerings found in chapter 1. So that would that be, one from the herd, from the flock, and an offering of the birds?
We're gonna go through all of the offering. If you just we're gonna eventually touch on all of the offerings.
Okay.
Just
all right, I'll hold it.
Okay. All right, so how is Christ in Leviticus? The 5 offerings, which are the burnt offering, the grain offering, the fellowship offering, the sin offering, and the guilt offering, they all typify the person and the work of Christ in his sinless life, submission to the Father, that we might have fellowship with God. The Levitical sacrifice system was instituted by God for a people he had redeemed from Egypt at the time of the Passover. Remember the Passover. To offer a sacrifice to Yahweh wasn't the human effort seeking to obtain favor with a hop to God, but a response to God, who had first given himself to Israel in a covenant relationship. Now remember, if we go back to the gods of Egypt, sacrifices were also done to those gods, but they were done to gain favor. That's not what God is asking for here. He is asking for them to offer up sacrifices in response to him first giving himself to Israel in a covenant relationship. So again, when we worship, when we offer up sacrifices to God, sacrifice of worship, we are not doing so God can withhold his judgment from us, or some type of punishment, or don't bring down a rainstorm, or some type of favor, but we are doing it in response to what God has already given for us. God was the first to make the sacrifice through his son. And so this is different. The people they understood sacrifices because they had done that in Egypt. But God is saying, no, you're not doing it to gain favor. You are doing it in response to what I have already done for you. So the sacrifices were to restore fellowship whenever sin or impurity, whether moral or ceremonial, disrupted this fellowship. So remember the three kinds of laws. There was the ceremonial law, the moral law, and the civil law. We're going to talk about the offering. But also when we see Christ also in Leviticus through this high priest. The high priest is a very prominent type of Christ, or a foreshadow of Christ. We're going to see that. And then there are 7 feasts which are prophetic of the Savior. So in Leviticus 1 through 7, and you may not have had an opportunity to read through it, but 1 through 7, you're going to run upon 5 types of offerings: the burnt offering, the grain offering, fellowship offering, sin offering, and the guilt offering. Each one of these offerings in Leviticus, if we translate them to Christ, which we will, you will be able to see Christ took the place of all of these. Okay, so we would not have to do these offerings today because Christ took care of them. So although God had promised to make Israel a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, the people needed to know how to achieve this goal. The primary function of the Levitical worship system, including the priesthood, is to effect atonement for sin through the offering of sacrifices. The concept of sacrifices or offering comes from a Hebrew word meaning to bring near. It refers to anything presented to God when one approaches his sanctuary. So in order for the people or even the priest to approach the sanctuary, there had to be an offering or a sacrifice made. Again, we don't have to do that because Christ has already done that. When sacrifices are offered, the individual came to draw near to God with hope that the sacrifice would be accepted and that his sin would be atoned. The goal of the worshiper was to be reconciled with Yahweh through the offering of a sacrifice. So they offered up sacrifices, in other words, to try to atone for sin in order that they may approach God to worship, if that makes any sense. But again, we don't have to do that. Pastor Green, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think what I see and what I think we're seeing as it relates to the offerings and the sacrifice, and I'm glad you pointed out that from chapter 1 all the way through 10, 11, we're going to go back over, and there will be instructions in Leviticus as to how each offering is to be done, and the instructions for each, which is pretty thorough. It can't just come anyway. The burnt offering, the grain offering, fellowship offering, the sin offering, and the guilt offering are all there with instructions that Moses is being instructed to pass on to Aaron and his boys, that they know how to approach the altar as intermediaries for us to God. It's like they will represent the people before an holy God and bring atonement and at one for us. It's they are the intermediaries there. They are the source that's communicating with God and for us. Now, you mentioned earlier how Jesus Christ fulfill the law and the prophets. He said, I did not come to destroy, but I come to fulfill. So the sacrificial system that we're reading about to bring us to God was all fulfilled in Jesus' saving work. It is through Jesus. And therefore, if we accept Jesus as our Lord and Savior, one who knew no sin but died for sin, then Jesus can bring us in right relationship and right standing with God. And so our sacrifice is not to kill an animal to burn on the altar, but is one of a living aliveness every day, how we practice it in our daily life. So the parallel is there, and we can see the fulfillment of these laws in Jesus when he said, I did not come to destroy the law and the prophets, but I came. My purpose in coming is that we introduce and institute another system of sacrifice. For all you folk who don't have cattle and sheep and flock and herd and pigeons, you can live for me. It's like he saw what we were coming into with all the people that would be on the planet. And that would not be enough animals for everybody to be bringing a 1-year-old yearling or bull to be sacrificed. That would be quite a few animals being sacrificed for each of us. So he knew what he was doing. And I thank God that you're taking the time to walk us through Leviticus, that our foundation may be solid. Thanks.
Thank you. Now, when we talk about the sacrifice, you're going to also see the feast, that there were 7 feasts or 7 holidays that the Israel was instructed to follow. And these were observances or remembering of certain things that were happening. And so there are 7 biblical holidays in the Old Testament, that specifically in Leviticus, that the Jews still follow today. But if we look closely, there are parallels, there are Christian meanings or parallels that we also observe. And so there are spring holidays and there are fall holidays, or fall spring feast and fall feast. The first one we see is Passover, and we remember what Passover is. It is, remember when the blood was put over the doorpost, and God said all those who have that blood over the doorpost, the death angel is going to pass over it, and so, but remember, how do we celebrate that? The Passover, Jesus was observing the Passover the Thursday before his crucifixion. And so we too are to remember or observe. Now, we don't do the Passover, but as the Christian event for this would be the Lord's Supper, the crucifixion of Jesus during that time. So again, look at the parallel. When we look at the first fruits, and we're going to talk about all of these a little bit more in depth, but I just want to show you tonight, the first fruit would be the resurrection of Jesus. The resurrection of Jesus. But before we get to that one, I'm sorry, the unleavened bread. The unleavened bread would be the burial of Jesus. The burial of Jesus. The first fruit would be the resurrection of Jesus. And between the first fruit and Pentecost, remember, 50 days after the first fruit, you're going to observe Pentecost. 50 days after the resurrection, we celebrate or remember the day of Pentecost when the Holy Spirit came. Okay? So again, these are familiar terms to us that were first introduced in Leviticus. Leviticus 23. And we'll get to them a little bit later, but I'm just introducing because I want you to understand and not be afraid of Leviticus, because what you're reading is going to be familiar to you, and the way that we break it down, you're not going to have a problem with it from here on out. So we'll get over to the fall part of the year. We have the trumpets. Now, these first four over here have already taken place. These first four, the Passover, the crucifixion, the burial, the resurrection, the Pentecost, all of this is already taking place, okay? When we get over to the fall holidays, we have the trumpet. Now, this is what will take place, will be called the gathering of the church. Remember when the trumpet sounds, you're going to hear that or see that when the trumpet sounds, you know, the dead in Christ shall rise, all of this stuff. This is the gathering of the church. Okay, now, of course, when the trumpet sounds in Leviticus, what it is saying is that this is an important event that's going to take place. We need all the people together. Okay, we need all of the people together. When the trumpet is sound, it's kind of like the intercom system, that all the people are together because something special is going to take place. So for us, when Christ returns, the trumpet is going to sound, and it's going to be the final trumpet, the rapture. The Day of Atonement, this is the second coming of Jesus. Now, for the Jews, it will be the first coming of the Messiah, because they don't believe that the Messiah has come. They are looking for the Messiah to come. So for them, it's going to be the first. For us, it's going to be the second. LaTanya, did you have a question?
Nope, I just hit the button by mistake. So.
All right, that's okay. Okay, and then when we get to the tabernacles, the last one, this is when God, the earthly kingdom is going to be set up. So again, as we get to Leviticus 23, you're going to see all of these holidays, how God is going to instruct, how they are going to remember these things perpetually. Okay, perpetually. And to this day, the Jews celebrate or remember these feasts. Okay, the demands of holiness also require strict adherence to the times of holy convocations appointed by God. In other words, when there's a gathering of community, all right, the feasts were a reminder of the unique relationship that Israel had with Yahweh. So how is this book divided? As Pastor Green kind of like talked about before, falls into two basic divisions: the public worship, sacrifice, and also the private worship. Chapters 1 through 16 is the holy sacrifices to a holy God. And we're going to, during this time, we'll talk about the laws of sacrifice for approaching God, how the priests were to be consecrated. Now, remember, the priests themselves were unworthy. They had to be taken care of first before they could even begin to carry the sins of the people or to approach God on behalf of the people. We also will talk about the laws of purity, the laws of national atonement, and the second part will be holy living before a holy God. Okay. So Leviticus answers the important question: how can an unholy people approach a holy God? This is the way God is going to make that happen. In order to come near me, you're going to have to offer up sacrifices, offering to be able to come near me. So what does that mean for us? The only way that we can approach God is to come through his son Jesus. The sacrifice that Jesus did for us makes us unholy people able to approach a holy God. Leviticus shows a redeemed Israel that the only way to God is by sacrifice and the walk with God by separation. All the sacrifices in this book point to the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world. Leviticus also intends to show how Israel was to fulfill its covenant responsibility. First, God desires Israel to be set apart. They should believe, act, and look differently than Egypt and Canaan. That's very important for us. How we, as God people, we should look different from the world. Egypt and Canaan represent the world. It represents anything other than God. Secondly, God has called Israel to be set apart. He has called them to be a kingdom of priests. And a priest is the intermediary between God and others. That is why Jesus Christ is called the high, we know him as a high priest, because he was the buffer between us and God. So Leviticus and the New Testament, all Christians are holy saints. In most English translations, that is, they have been called by God to be his people, just as ancient Israel had. But this state of holiness must find expression in holy living. Sanctification is through obedience to the standard of teaching that God has given us. And 1 Peter 1:16 picks up kind of like what Leviticus says: be holy, for I am holy. Okay, so that takes us to the end of our lesson. Are there any other questions. Again, we're going to be talking about all of these sacrifices, offerings, and I hope that this introduction has given you a sense of what Leviticus is and has broken down some of the barriers to reading it or to understanding it. All right, Pastor Green, did you want to say something in ending?
Please, before we go tonight, I just want to remind us that the better foundation we have in the Old Testament, the easier it is to understand the New Testament. The foundation of the first 5 books of the Bible, not only does it gives us clarity for the rest of the Bible, but when we read it and the 150 numbers of the Psalm, and we see how the Psalms are divided also, where book 1 through 5 parallels the first 5 books of the Bible. But tonight, the intent, if I'm reading and listening and clearly, is that the book of Leviticus shows us the way to God, and then the second section shows us how to walk with God. The way to God and how to walk with God. It's a mindset of sacrifice, sacrificial living, and then our practice in our daily sacrifice. He said, thus just be holy. Don't pray for it. Don't go look for it. Just be it. My prayer for us is that as we see the history of the people of God, that when we get to the New Testament and the book of Acts, then we'll see the history of the New Testament church and how that those Jews were practicing the laws from the books of Moses, the first 5 books, and the problem they had with Jesus. Jesus came to fulfill, and they wanted to continue to practice. They just didn't expect him to be the Messiah. And therein is the dividing line between Judaism and Christianity. We believe Jesus to be the Messiah. They don't. Thank you so much.